Cops, what were some cases you worked on that made you think that something supernatural was going on? I have been in law enforcement for nearly 6 years, and during my shifts, I have experienced a handful of strange supernatural occurrences. The most recent one came from a 911 hang-up call, and it remains one of the eeriest experiences of my career. I was riding in a two-person unit on a warm summer night, probably around 2 or 3 in the morning, when we received a call for a 911 hang-up. The only comment from dispatch was that a call had been placed to 911 and the person hung up immediately. When dispatch tried to call the number back, there was no answer. The area I was patrolling that night is one I have basically spent my entire career in, so there were not many streets I had yet to respond to. However, the address associated with this call, determined by GPS coordinates since the caller had hung up, was somewhere I had never been. I had driven past the road numerous times, but I had never actually received a call originating from it. We pulled up to an old dirt road, blocked by a metal chain across the entrance, with a weathered no trespassing sign hanging prominently. Since we needed to figure out what was happening, my partner and I continued on foot, walking up a long dirt and gravel path, probably around 100 yards in length. The worst part was that tall chain-link fences ran along both sides of the road, creating a narrow funnel. If someone had been waiting at the end with, say, an assault rifle, we would have had absolutely no cover. Thankfully, that did not happen. At the end of the road, 2 houses stood, one on either side. Initially, we assumed one of them was the source of the 911 hang-up call. As I shone my flashlight on one of the houses, I saw movement inside. Instantly, I thought, oh crap, people actually live back here. I had assumed the houses would be abandoned and empty. Shortly afterward, a man and a woman stepped outside and asked what was going on. We explained that we had received a 911 hang-up call from 123 Main and asked if they had placed the call. The man said his address was 124 Main, and the house across the street was 125 Main, which he said was vacant. He proceeded to explain that 123 Main was further north, hidden in a thick patch of weeds and forest, completely overgrown. He added that the house was vacant, run down, and could only be reached on foot, probably a couple of football fields from his house. While we were walking and investigating, we received 2 more 911 hang-up calls from the same address, both with the same result. Before venturing further into the woods, we called for backup, and another 2-person unit eventually arrived. The 4 of us proceeded into the woods, 2 of us carrying assault rifles. We followed a barely beaten path, fighting through spiderwebs and low-hanging tree branches until we reached our destination. The house looked like it had been lifted straight from a horror movie. It was run down, with a tree that had fallen through the center, now fused into the structure over the years. The house was nearly collapsing and entirely overgrown with greenery. Despite its ominous appearance, we pressed on, determined to investigate. After struggling through thick brush, we found an entrance, climbing over fallen brick walls and decaying wooden debris. My biggest fear at that moment was that the rotten house might collapse on itself while we were inside, trapping us with no way out. We searched the entire house thoroughly, every room, every corner, leaving nothing unchecked. Feeling satisfied that there was no one inside, we climbed back out and began heading toward the original 2 houses. As we walked, dispatch radioed to report another 911 hang-up from the same address. This time, they were able to call back, and the person on the line sounded like a child playing on the phone. The 4 of us exchanged glances and decided we were done investigating. We had done everything we could and were not about to enter a potentially dangerous house based solely on what might have been a child's voice. We cleared the call, and no further hang-ups came in for the rest of the night. Fast forward approximately 6 months, during a bitterly cold winter. Another 911 hang-up originated from the same address. This time, I was accompanied by 3 officers who had not been on the initial call. I recounted the story in detail, and all 3 were eager to see the house for themselves. With the cold having killed off much of the greenery, reaching the location was far easier than before. The 3 decided to enter the house, while I waited outside, having already experienced enough of its eerie atmosphere. They did not get far before realizing that the structure was on the verge of collapse. We left promptly, with no further calls from a child or any other strange activity that night. If I ever return to this location, I hope to capture a photograph of the house so that when I recount the story to others, they can understand just how messed up and unnerving the property is. Story 2. I was only a few months away from finishing field training when I received a call for a suspicious incident in the southwest zone of our jurisdiction. Dispatch advised that the caller had reported seeing a single light in the sky. At the time, I was only a few blocks north of the reported location and had heard what sounded like an electrical transformer blow just a few minutes before the call. Naturally, I assumed the caller had simply seen the flash that often accompanies these minor noisy electrical explosions, and I mentally prepared to explain it as such. While I was en route, dispatch further advised that the subject had made statements suggesting the light was, as they described, of the biblical variety, claiming it had made him feel warm. Great. For those unfamiliar, the relationship between law enforcement and individuals with mental illness can be incredibly complex. Interactions with mentally ill persons have increased drastically over the years and show no signs of slowing down, despite the implementation of crisis intervention training, which often helps but sometimes complicates the situation further. I requested records of any prior interactions with the subject, and dispatch relayed what one might expect. There were numerous calls reporting disturbances in his home, yet no actual incidents were ever confirmed. There were also reports of angels appearing in his bedroom and civil disturbances resulting from him talking to himself on train platforms. In short, it was the standard history of someone dealing with serious mental health challenges. There was also an officer safety alert. Fantastic. I assumed it was another transformer issue, nothing more. When I arrived on scene, I noticed a man standing calmly in the snow on the sidewalk. He wore a well-worn brown winter jacket, faded blue jeans, and, surprisingly, a pair of pristine white New Balance shoes. I remember thinking how impossibly clean the shoes appeared, despite the heavy wear along their outer edges, as if they had been carefully maintained for decades. The subject, whom I will call Tim, had the most peaceful expression I had ever seen, with his hands clasped in what I would describe as the communion hold. For those unfamiliar, if you have ever received communion, you cup your hands to receive the wafer. Tim's hands were held in exactly that position. He waved to me as I parked. I approached and introduced myself. "Hey sir, I'm Officer X. How are you feeling today?" Tim immediately began an impossibly long run-on sentence, the gist of which was him asking if I had seen the light and accepted God's angel into my life. Sorry, Tim, I must have missed that one. I already had my conclusion and didn't want to spend any longer than necessary, knowing the site committal paperwork would be tedious and time-consuming. I launched into a rational explanation, telling him that a transformer had likely blown in the area and that the light he saw was the flash associated with the explosion. The entire time, Tim smiled and shook his head at me. That is when he said it was not a simple flash, but a large circle of light that made no noise. It floated above him, rather angelically, for what he perceived as hours, casting a warmth on his skin, which he described as God's touch, expelling his demons. As the large circle of light moved away, Tim explained that the electrical box exploded only after the light passed over it. This was the point where my deep-seated fear of UFOs kicked in. I genuinely dread even discussing them. I quickly tried to disprove Tim's account, and not wanting to entertain the possibility, I asked him for his identification. Tim handed it over, and I discovered that he lived just a couple of houses down the street. I tried to convince him to return home, confident that nothing unusual had occurred. I inquired about his medications, illicit drug use, and alcohol consumption. The whole standard investigation. Everything checked out. Tim was simply, by all accounts, a standard eccentric individual. Cool. Time to leave. He then showed me his watch, a Casio with a Velcro band and the face positioned on his inner wrist. Instead of numbers, the display had small zeros, similar to those found on calculators with narrow ends and small gaps. If you have ever spelled 800,085 on a calculator, you understand what I mean. There were also some dashes. It appeared to be a 30-year-old watch that had been broken for nearly 29 years. I started to ask if I could accompany Tim back to his house when something in my chest tightened, giving me what could have been my very first panic attack, internally, of course. No one wants to see a cop hyperventilate and completely freak out. I looked closely at the circle in the snow and noticed a razor-sharp edge. The interior of the circle appeared slightly melted and sunken compared to the outer edge, almost as if someone had turned a burner beneath the snow. What shook me most was the contrast in footprints. Tim's footprints leading into the circle seemed aged and rounded, like they had been there for a day or two, while the ones outside the circle, including mine, were fresh and crisp. At that moment, my cover officer arrived. Typically, one is dispatched whenever an officer's safety alert is issued for a subject. It was my former FTO, and thankfully, I felt comfortable enough to reveal a bit of panic. I pulled him aside in my car and explained everything. He suggested the circle might be caused by gas or sewer-related factors, something terrestrial, and appeared calm. I wanted to believe him, but deep down, I was still unnerved. He walked Tim safely back to his house, ensuring no medical treatment was necessary, and the scene concluded. After returning to my car, I tried to clear the call on my laptop, but the MDT froze completely. Not unusual, but still irritating. I mic'd up and informed dispatch that I was 10-8, and after dealing with static issues, the connection finally went through. I took out my phone to call my FTO and explain how far down the rabbit hole I had gone before he arrived. Oddly, my phone had locked up on the keypad screen, requiring me to pull the battery to reset it. After the reset, I called my FTO and he simply told me to think of horses when you hear hoofbeats, not zebras. I felt a bit foolish and decided to keep the story private, as UFOs were not covered by department policy, and as a probationary officer, I could have been in real trouble. I avoided that street for a couple of months, trying desperately to forget the incident. Eventually, I received a call for a burglar alarm at a home on the cul-de-sac at the end of the same street. The homeowner mentioned the alarm had triggered only once before, and when I inquired about the timing, he revealed it had happened when he saw a large light glide over his house a few months prior. Crap. From that moment on, I never drove down that street alone at night. It remains one of 3 incidents in my career involving unexplained lights, with the other 2 taking place over Lake Michigan's shoreline. Story 3. I served in the Swiss military with the 18th/2nd Panzer Division. I racked my brain for quite a while, trying to remember if any unusual incidents had occurred during my service, and one finally came to mind. It was during one of my repetition courses, which is a refresher training that soldiers must attend yearly. You can either do a full-year program or a shorter refresher course for a few weeks, but you must return every year for a month for the refresher. This particular incident happened around 3 or 4 years ago, if memory serves me right. As a tanker, we follow a 3-year rotation between 2 different training spots. One location is in Bure for 2 consecutive years for the pilots to drive on a large terrain, and the other is in Hinterrhein for us loaders and shooters to practice our firing techniques with the tanks. During this particular year, I was stationed in the Hinterrhein Valley. If you're curious, you can Google map it as Hinterrhein Schießplatz to get an idea of the valley layout and its elongated shooting range. The valley itself is long, flanked by mountains on both sides, with targets at the far end, roughly 4 kilometers from the entrance. At the entrance to the area, there's a covered hangar where we leave the tanks overnight after servicing them. It was one of the weekends when my company was assigned to guard duty, and as usual, I was assigned the night shift from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m., following a 2-hour rotation schedule. For those unfamiliar with the concept, it means 2 hours at the guard booth, 2 hours on sidelines but alert, then 2 hours of car patrol and repeating the cycle. I was stationed with my colleague Pitch, first letters of his family name, full name irrelevant, at the guard booth. During the winter months, it was quite chilly to remain outside for long, so we mostly stayed inside, occasionally taking walks around the post and checking in with the base over the radio for routine updates. Since it was nighttime, we were issued NVGs, night vision goggles, because the valley is large and unlit, making them essential for foot patrols. While my colleagues stayed inside keeping warm, I took advantage of my Russian heritage and braved the cold outside for a smoke and a quick scan of the area. With my personal resistance to freezing temperatures, I moved down the path towards the targets, smoking while keeping my eyes peeled, using either the flashlight or NVGs to inspect the area. Eventually, I returned to the guard booth, circled the road, and headed into the hangar. Yes, the hangar. The one filled with a dozen 60-ton war machines, and nothing else except a few brooms and dust cloths. To paint a better picture, the hangar is mostly straight but slightly curved, with parked tanks leaving about a 1-meter gap between each, and a larger 3 to 4 meter gap on the left flank for passage. I was feeling confident, perhaps too cocky. I mean, it's Switzerland. We had parked and serviced the tanks just 4 hours earlier. What could go wrong, right? Wrong. I am very familiar with the sounds these machines make. I can distinguish the sound of a falling tool, the air vents cycling gases, and the dead silence of a hangar at night when nothing is operating. Yet I also know the unsettling feeling of dead air, when something feels off, and dread creeps up your spine. That night, as I walked past the furthest door into the hangar and made my way slowly towards where we had parked the tanks for the night, that dead air hit me like a wall. It felt wrong in a way I can't fully explain. I am not going to claim shadow people or peripheral visions. Thankfully, I've never experienced that. However, upon reaching the first row of tanks, I distinctly heard noises. Tools, to be precise. A click here, a bolt drop there. I initially assumed it was normal, perhaps a technician working late or someone retrieving their phone from a crew compartment. Tanks occasionally break down, so it made a certain sense. I called out, shining my flashlight around to alert whoever it was of my presence. Of course, silence. Nothing. The curve of the hangar obstructed my direct view of the far end. So, what's a soldier to do but climb one of the tanks and put on NVGs for a clearer overview? I did exactly that, scanning over the turrets, down the entire column. Again, nothing. No open hatches, no scattered tools, complete silence. Then, as if mocking logic, the noises started again. Wrenches, unbolted armored skirts swinging, and turret hatch locking lugs moving. The sounds seemed to come from further down the line, away from me. I crept carefully from tank to tank, NVGs slightly distorting depth perception, trying not to break my neck while tracking the source. Still nothing visible. The dread thickened, not from fear per se, but from the impossible scenario of hearing things that logically shouldn't exist. Eventually, I exited the hangar through the opposite door after checking every corner, side room, and underneath the tanks, returning to my colleague at the booth. I recounted the story. He laughed it off, but refused to inspect the hangar himself afterwards. It may seem lackluster to some, but it stuck with me because of how familiar I am with every sound these machines make. After 5 months of shooting, loading, cleaning, and servicing them, you internalize the tiniest noises and irregularities. This was a unique, inexplicable event I never reported, formally to superiors, but it remains vivid in memory. On a graveyard shift guarding a tank hangar and firing range during my army service, the supposed all clear inside the hangar felt far from certain. Strange, impossible mechanical noises echoed through the space, and by the time I stepped outside, I was convinced that at least one of the tanks was haunted or possessed by a restless ghost mechanic. Story 4. My house has motion detecting lights on each corner, all facing away from the house. When something triggers the lights, they stay on for approximately 2 minutes before turning off automatically. I had just returned home from work around 1 a.m., and my 3 dogs greeted me at the front door. Usually, they jump all over me, showering me with affection and excitement, but this time, they seemed spooked, almost as if they had done something they were not supposed to and were afraid I would notice. Their behavior immediately made me uneasy, but I tried to shake it off. After work, I always let them out the front door to use the bathroom, and they normally return right away for a treat. On this night, I noticed that the headlights were on in my parents' 1965 MG, which they store at my house. This was not the car I drove, and I do not even have a key to unlock it, so I immediately thought someone might have broken into the vehicle. I leashed one of the dogs, a pit lab mix, and started walking around the house to investigate. As I made my way around, each motion detecting light turned on as expected when I passed it. I retraced my steps back around the house, and the lights again turned on one after another in the usual pattern. Despite this, I saw and heard nothing unusual during my perimeter check, which made the situation even more unnerving. We eventually got back inside, cleaned up, and crawled into bed. My basset hound was the only one who sleeps on my bed, while the other 2 dogs stay in their own beds near the back door, which leads to the porch and fenced side yard. When they go outside, it triggers 3 motion detecting lights, so I usually can tell immediately if any dog is out. My basset hound lay at the end of my bed with his head propped up, constantly tracking something with his eyes and head, refusing to fully lie down. Suddenly, one of the motion-detecting lights outside a window by the doggy door illuminated the yard. I initially assumed one of the dogs had gone outside, even though the other two lights did not turn on as they normally would. My heart started pounding, and I had to check. None of my dogs were outside. At this point, I was absolutely terrified. I looked out the windows but saw nothing, and the light eventually turned off. As I crawled back into bed, I noticed each motion light turn on and off in sequence. But now, it felt like someone was running around the house. Then, they switched direction, as though retracing my path from the earlier perimeter walk. I was literally shaking, completely unnerved. I texted my friends and family essentially saying, "I am going to call the cops, so if it is you, just stop." No one admitted to it, and some did not respond at all. One of my bedroom windows looks into the fenced backyard. Both gates were locked and secured from the inside with extra bungee cords because I had someone repairing screens on our porch, and I did not want them opening the gates and meeting one of my aggressive dogs. Suddenly, it was as if a giant spotlight was shining directly through my window behind my headboard. None of the motion-detecting lights faced the house, so this was completely abnormal. The light was so bright that I could not see anything on my TV. I did not move, and my dogs did not react. My basset hound seemed completely unaware. Oddly, the motion lights did not turn off after their usual 2 minutes, which was extremely unsettling. The intense light eventually shut off, plunging the bedroom into pitch darkness. At that same moment, my PS4 turned on, not on the TV, but the blue indicator light illuminated, and I could hear the startup sound. I was on the verge of tears, and I wanted to go to the kitchen to grab a knife for protection. As soon as I stood up, all the motion lights outside immediately turned off, and my office printer started running on its own. I cautiously made my way to the kitchen, and another motion light turned on, shining over the pool area. I then moved to the sunroom, which gives a clear view of the backyard and pool remaining inside. Nothing unusual appeared outside. Returning to the house, I heard Alexa in the sunroom say something about being unable to play a song and needing to set up a Pandora account. I rushed to the knife drawer and inexplicably found 3 dead monarch butterflies inside. I have no idea how they got there. It could have been a coincidence, but the timing was extremely disturbing. I grabbed a knife and sat in the bathroom for the remainder of the night, staying awake until sunrise, terrified that someone, or something, was outside and intending to end my life. When daylight finally arrived, I felt safe enough to go outside and check all the gates and doors. Everything remained locked from the inside. I walked around the pool area and noticed more dead monarch butterflies scattered across the deck and floating in the pool. I have no explanation for their presence, and the experience has left me completely unnerved. I still have no idea whether someone was attempting to prank me, or if something far stranger, perhaps even paranormal, was at play. Regardless, I never want to experience anything like that again. The memory of the lights, the PS4 turning on, the printer activating, and the butterflies will haunt me indefinitely. Story 5. PEI is a lovely place where I would spend my summers as a youth, and it always carried a soft, peaceful charm that made those months unforgettable. I'm actually going this August for the air show, mostly because it brings back that old comfort I used to feel. Anyways, my parents owned a summer house in Anglo Rustico, Rosie Lane to be exact, for several years. And the house was built on land that had once been an old farm, then divided into separate lots, so we weren't the only house around. My sister and I, funny enough, were just talking about this again last night at my dad's, and I realized we never got a restful night's sleep in that house. By contrast, at our friend's cottage just 5 minutes away, we would sleep like absolute babies, completely undisturbed. The house had been newly built in the mid-90s, but we only began staying there for extended periods in the late 90s, when our summer routines became more settled. From the very beginning, my sister would insist she saw swoops or sudden flashes of light at her window at night. She always described them with a shaky, nervous tone that made it feel as though she were witnessing something far stranger than a simple reflection. My parents dismissed this as shooting stars, then I started seeing the same thing, which made the whole situation feel more unnerving than before. By this point, I was already interested in the paranormal as a teen, so I decided to research for an explanation and see if anything made sense. Rather than dismissing my sister, I asked her to explain what she saw, to record the times, and we would try to figure out a pattern. And that went well for about 3 nights as we took it surprisingly seriously. The patterns of light would appear around 10:30 to 10:35. Some would be fainter, like someone waving a dying flashlight, while others would be an intense, bright glow that stretched across the window. On the 4th night of recording the mystery, my parents headed into Charlottetown for dinner and left us alone, which wasn't unusual for us at all. No big deal. We had satellite TV and a BBQ, and with that comfort, we started watching a movie as the evening settled. It was now getting close to that time, and our living room faced the road, so seeing car lights through the blinds was normal. Keep in mind, where we were, it was pitch black at night. I had gotten up to get something out of the fridge, and I saw a flickering of bright lights, figuring it was my parents returning home. My sister got up and opened the blinds, and when she did, the room lit up like daytime, and she let out the most horrifying shout I had ever heard. I dropped what I had in my hands, which I believe was a glass bottle of soda, and ran over. But by then it was gone, as it had vanished into the night. She was in near shock, breathing hard and staring like she was trying to understand something impossible. I had asked what she had seen, and all she said was, a woman with a hidden face wearing an old-time dress appearing like she was glowing from heat. And that description still chills me. I stupidly said, like the opening scene in Ghostbusters. "One." And she replied, "Yeah, sorta." Though her voice shook badly. We were totally freaked out, but not so terrified that we stopped being curious, because it only added to the mystery we had already started unraveling. My parents finally got home, and we didn't say a word, partly because we didn't want to scare them, and partly because we couldn't explain it properly. Funny, because after the apparition, there were no more 10:30 swoops of lights or other activities ever again, as if something finally finished whatever it needed to do. For fun, I started looking at old aerial photos and discovered there had been an old farmhouse a few hundred feet away from our property, which made everything feel even stranger. The great thing about PEI is that the old-timers remember everything, and it is easy to get info from them. One of our neighbors, who lived a few streets over and also ran the local dump, had lived in the same house for his entire life. He was in his 80s by this point and knew every story tied to the land. I randomly asked him one day about the old farmhouse, and he said it had burned down in the early 40s and the farmer's wife had died in the fire, explaining it in a gentle but chilling tone. He said in those days there was no fire department and the house just burned, and people could do nothing but watch helplessly. They found her body, and she was wearing a dress or long skirt that got caught on something as she ran down the stairs, then tripped and never made it out, a detail he delivered quietly so it wouldn't feel too harsh. He obviously saw I was interested in the story and told me more about the family and their hardships. However, just as I was about to leave, the old-timer put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Look, I know about the strange crap with the lights, and her appearing. Don't walk where the old house was. I guess she doesn't like strangers walking in," which sent a quiet chill down my back. Trust me, it sounded more like advice than a warning. I had told my sister about the conversation I had with Mr. Blanchard. Then I asked if she had walked where the old house was, and she said yes, but didn't know, as that area was just a slight depression in the ground after our property ended. She took me to the edge of the spot, and sure enough, there was a slight depression with a different color of grass, standing out like a subtle mark of history. She said sorry for walking in when she wasn't welcome, her voice soft like she genuinely meant it. A couple of days later, I was walking on our land, which was all manicured and just cut, and I found a random rusty horseshoe lying in the freshly cut grass, which was super strange considering no one had reason to place it there. I hung it up on our flagpole, almost like a protective charm, without saying it out loud. A couple of years later, my dad tried to purchase that land, but the owner's family always refused to sell it. We owned the lot in back of us, and the one to the right of that one if you faced north, creating a property shaped like an upside-down L. My parents ended up selling the house and property in 2010. Once my sister and I started getting further in our careers, we stopped going, and my parents stopped spending entire summers in PEI since life kept getting busier. They didn't go up for 2 years. And I still remember the first time we went in 1990, crossing over on a ferry, vacation land. Then seeing the bridge getting built like a massive spine across the water. PEI is a lovely but funny little place, filled with quiet stories and lingering old memories. Now I know why my parents loved going there, because it was a complete and pleasant getaway from hectic city life. Maybe one day I will tell the tales of lights out on the water that weren't fishing boats, or the red object that came out of a field, or the other unexplained phenomenon in daylight, such as the man wearing a tweed suit sitting on an old gravestone, which stayed in my mind for years afterward. Story 6. I was an EMT for a while, and during that time I encountered some downright surreal situations. One day, we received a call about someone riding their bike at breakneck speed who collided headfirst with a car while not wearing a helmet. We responded immediately, sirens and all. Despite the fact that it was broad daylight and we were in the middle of suburbia on a Saturday, not a single person had come to check on the poor man. The streets were empty, which was extremely unusual. Normally, a violent accident like this would attract a massive crowd instantly. When we arrived, his skull was severely damaged and he was unresponsive. It was the worst head injury I had ever seen in my time as an EMT. We quickly assessed him and determined that he had a major skull fracture, a severe concussion, and was bleeding profusely. He was also missing teeth and had a minor road rash, but fortunately he wasn't missing much skin. To give you an idea of how dire it was, this was the type of injury that most people do not survive. And if you did survive, you would likely end up with permanent severe disabilities. Normally, we would have moved him off the road, but with a head and neck injury, moving him prematurely is extremely dangerous. My partner, who was also training me since I was still fairly new, crouched down to check his pulse while I began unloading our gear. He felt a pulse for several tense moments, then stood up and opened his mouth to say something. Suddenly, the man leapt upright. He did not use his arms to push himself up. He just freaking jumped to his feet instantly. The movement startled both of us completely. He looked at us, smiled, and attempted to grab his bike. We tried to stop him, but we didn't want to wrestle him to the ground, given his critical condition. He slipped away from our grasp and bolted into the nearby woods without his bike. My partner was in total disbelief, staring at the spot where the man had disappeared, mouth agape. Then he turned to me and muttered, "He had no friggin' pulse, man." I asked if he was certain, and he swore up and down that the biker was clinically dead when we arrived. We immediately contacted the authorities for assistance, and they dispatched a search and rescue team into the forest. I do not know if they found him or not, because EMTs typically do not receive follow-up information once a patient is turned over to professionals. Keep in mind, this occurred in the Pine Barrens, an area with vast stretches of forest that can be extremely difficult to search. My best guess is that he somehow wandered to a loved one's house in a confused state. What puzzled me even more was that head injuries like this usually cause heavy bleeding, so you would think there would be a noticeable trail of blood for the authorities to follow. I should clarify some details. I am no longer an EMT, having worked in the field for about 1 year before switching to pursue a career in computer science. Also, EMTs and paramedics are very different. We are only taught basic first aid and then take a simple test. It is essentially the lowest level role in the medical field. Legally, we cannot pronounce anyone dead, and fatal accidents are typically left to the more qualified personnel. If the man had truly been dead, we would not have been able to do much beyond keeping him stable until help arrived. I did not mean this was a fatal accident in itself. The shock was not that he somehow revived, but that he was fully alive despite lacking a detectable pulse. The man had been riding his bike extremely quickly through a suburban area when he struck a parked car, which was a hatchback. The house the car was parked outside of presumably belonged to the person who called us. Strangely, nobody in the vicinity seemed to notice or respond to the accident, which was highly unusual in broad daylight. Head injuries like his can often cause people to become aggressive or uncooperative, so extreme caution is required when moving them to avoid damaging the spine. When he suddenly got up, it completely caught both of us off guard, especially because he moved with startling speed. As he attempted to retrieve his bike, my partner reached for his arm to try to restrain him. The man quickly slipped away, running into the forest. We immediately informed authorities, and they dispatched a small team to locate him. From what I can gather, they must have eventually found him, as he was never reported missing, and there were no further reports of him afterward. I can say with complete confidence that when we first arrived, he He had no detectable pulse. Yet, somehow, against all odds, he was still alive. It remains one of the most bizarre and inexplicable moments I have witnessed during my time as an EMT. Clarified the accident wasn't fatal, highlighted the unusual scene, and shared a quick shout-out to a friend's Bandcamp music. Story 7. A couple of weeks after first seeing this thread, the mention of Atco Ghost immediately caught my attention. This local legend has fascinated me since high school, weaving a mix of eerie folklore and unexplained phenomena into a story that lingers in the mind long after it is told, captivating both curiosity and imagination. Atco is an unassuming town in South Jersey, like many in the region, with nothing remarkable on the surface. Burnt Mill Road runs along the edge of the Pine Barrens, lined with residential homes, and ends where the dense forest begins. Despite its ordinary appearance, the area carries a reputation steeped in ghost stories and local legends that persist to this day. According to the ever-reliable and locally cherished lore, two teenagers were racing their cars down Burnt Mill Road one night, long ago, when a child happened to be playing in the middle of the street at the far end. Tragically, he was struck and offed by one of the cars, and the teenagers fled, never to be identified or caught. Legend claims that the ghost of the child still wanders the end of Burnt Mill Road every evening, patiently waiting for those responsible to return. While the logic may be questionable, the story persists. Along the road, there is a telephone pole marked with a large X, and directly beneath it lies a faint chalk outline of a small child's body. Local tradition dictates that if one drives to this spot, turns off the engine, honks 3 times, and flashes the high beams 3 times, the Atco ghost is said to appear, inspiring terror and a hasty retreat. I have visited the site dozens of times, and it has become one of my favorite places to take both new visitors and those who have been before. For a period, I would park near the chalk outline, simply to sit and absorb the strange energy of the spot, finding a peculiar comfort in its stillness and the layers of story surrounding it. Most of the visits passed uneventfully, a blend of curiosity and mild superstition. Yet a few experiences remain impossible to forget, standing out sharply from the rest. The first memorable encounter occurred one night in 2007. While terrifying at the moment, I later concluded that the events of that night had a rational explanation, and sharing it would contribute little to the story of the location's mystery. It served more as a reminder of how perception can amplify ordinary events in places steeped in local legend. The second, however, unfolded in broad daylight 2 years later, and it is by far the strangest, most inexplicable thing I have ever witnessed. My girlfriend and I were driving through the area in the late afternoon when I casually suggested we visit Burnt Mill Road. She had never been there, and though the optimal time for experiencing the legends is undeniable at night, her excitement made the idea irresistible. We drove down the familiar road, and I pointed out the telephone pole and the faded chalk outline, explaining the rituals tied to the ghost. After demonstrating the K-turn, I began driving back, taking care to navigate slowly along the smooth pavement. My car at the time was a 1991 Grand Marquis, a hulking, unwieldy boat of a vehicle that I loved dearly. With no built-in cup holders, I had improvised one of those plastic inserts wedged between the armrests. In it, I kept a pile of loose change, my girlfriend's coffee in a standard Starbucks cup with a lid and a small sippy opening, and her cell phone securely tucked in another slot. The placement was intentional, as every detail would soon matter. On our way back, I was driving extremely slowly, maybe around 15 miles per hour, taking care not to jostle anything in the car. The road wasn't riddled with the stereotypical New Jersey potholes, making for an unusually smooth ride, almost too perfect for a place with such a spooky reputation. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a strange buzzing sound filled the air. It sounded like a phone vibrating, but unlike anything I had ever heard before. The vibration was continuous, long, and uninterrupted, resonating in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, sending an instant shiver down my spine. We instinctively looked down at the cup holder, and to our complete astonishment, the pocket holding my girlfriend's phone was inexplicably filled to the brim with coffee, as though it had somehow defied all laws of physics. Beyond that pocket, there wasn't a single drop of coffee anywhere else in the car. Not on the seats, the floor, or even the center console. The Starbucks cup itself remained perfectly upright in its original cup holder, half full, separated from the phone by an entire ocean of loose pennies, nickels, and dimes, which were all completely bone dry. Not a single drop had touched the coins, the armrest, or the surrounding surfaces. The lid was still firmly in place on the Starbucks cup, yet somehow half of its liquid had miraculously teleported several inconvenient inches away, landing precisely in the pocket with the phone. Neither of us could make sense of what had just occurred, and for a moment, there was a stunned silence as we exchanged confused glances, trying to reconcile what we were witnessing with reality. I have replayed that moment in my mind hundreds of times since then, turning every possible scenario over, analyzing each variable, and still, I cannot for the life of me figure out how it could have happened. We were driving very slowly. The road was smooth. We hit no bumps. The cup holder was securely fastened between two gloriously comfortable maroon armrests. There is simply no rational way the coffee could have moved out of the snug fit pocket, tilted perfectly across the pile of loose coins, and positioned with the sippy hole directly above the other pocket, poured half of its contents onto the phone, only to then return to its original position without spilling a single drop anywhere else. What made the incident even more unsettling, beyond the sheer impossibility of it, is that it wasn't the dramatic or chaotic sort of paranormal activity you might expect at a haunted location. Instead, it was subtle, precise, and eerily deliberate, almost as if the Atco ghost itself had intervened with quiet mischief, leaving a clear, unmistakable message. "Please stop coming here, dude." The moment lingered in the car long after we drove away, leaving a strange combination of awe, disbelief, and respect for the unseen forces that may inhabit that road. Story 8. When we checked in, the staff shared stories about the ghosts said to haunt the place. Interestingly, they were all pre-Civil War spirits described as friendly, though I later heard whispers of a more malevolent ghost, reportedly a Civil War soldier who was less welcoming. There was Mary, a midwife who supposedly liked to tuck guests in at night, and a mischievous little boy named Jeremy who wandered the halls playing pranks. We received our room keys and went up to the assigned room that afternoon. The moment I sat on the bed, an immediate sense of unease washed over me, filling me with apprehension and discomfort. My husband mentioned he needed to run to the car to grab our bags, and I felt anxious even being alone for a few short minutes. Despite this, I brushed off the unease and tried to focus on enjoying our 3-day weekend in Gettysburg. To provide context regarding the setting and overall atmosphere, it was February, so the battlefields were entirely covered in snow, and the air was bitterly cold throughout our stay. Darkness fell unusually early, casting long, eerie shadows across the landscape. Yet, ironically, our room was uncomfortably hot, almost stifling. The space was small, and the radiator worked far too efficiently, forcing us to push the quilt down to our feet and rely solely on the sheet and blanket. At that stage of life, pre-children, I could typically sleep through almost anything. Noise, temperature, and movement rarely woke me. On the first night, I woke at exactly 3 in the morning. The room was so dark I couldn't even tell whether my eyes were open or closed. The stifling heat drove me to reach for the comforter, only to find it neatly and tightly tucked up to my chin, despite our having pushed it to our feet. I nudged my husband to alert him, but he simply grunted and went back to sleep. Oddly, the experience felt genuinely frightening, even though it was minor in scale. Forcing myself back to sleep, I awoke at the same time the following night, finding the comforter once again pulled up to my chest. On the third night, I wedged the comforter between the footboard and mattress, and this time, the phenomenon did not occur. Strangely, I never checked the clock, yet I was certain it was 3 a.m., a detail that still puzzles me in hindsight. On our second day, we spent hours exploring the snowy battlefields, absorbing the history and desolate winter atmosphere. That evening, we planned to attend a ghost storytelling session in the basement, scheduled for approximately 7:30 p.m. Nearby, a grandfather clock stood at the top of the stairs, just outside our room. Its chimes rang every 15 or 30 minutes, marking the passage of time, with each hour announced by a series of dings corresponding to the number of hours. At the conclusion of each hourly chime, footsteps could be heard ascending the stairs, slow and deliberate, creating an eerie and uncanny presence that unsettled anyone nearby. Initially, we found the footsteps odd, but not alarming. Preparing for the evening, we decided to take a short nap before the storytelling session. Lying on the bed in pitch darkness, thanks to February's long nights, we closed our eyes. When the 7 p.m. chime rang 7 times, the familiar footsteps ascended the stairs, but this time they did not stop at the top. Instead, they continued toward our room, the floor creaking under the invisible weight of each step. The sound of approach toward the foot of the bed was almost hypnotic, drawing an anxious attention we could not ignore. My husband turned on the light, halting the sound temporarily, but once off, the footsteps resumed, creeping once more to the bed's edge. The pattern repeated 4 or 5 times, each time heightening our tension and unease. Exhausted, we decided to ignore it, hoping to nap before the basement event, but the footsteps persisted relentlessly. Then, suddenly, something slammed into our bed with undeniable force. Shocked into silence, neither of us spoke. After what felt like an eternity, I cautiously asked, "Was that you?" My husband replied emphatically, "No, turn on the light." Terrified, I admitted I could not. Eventually, he rose and flicked the light on, discovering that the covers had tightened exactly where the impact occurred, confirming an inexplicable and truly frightening event. On the final day, we traveled to York to visit a friend. Upon returning to the room, opening the door released a sudden mass of wind that swept directly over our heads, moving our hair as if brushed by an unseen presence. Initially, it seemed logical to assume this was caused by the room being closed all day and the heater operating at full blast. However, the airflow was strangely localized, passing only over us rather than filling the doorway as one might expect, leaving an unexplainable and lingering sense of the paranormal in the space. That concludes the experience. Visiting the battlefields at dusk is recommended, especially if exploring the CD-guided tours, which allow driving through the historic grounds as the shadows grow long. Returning to the Farnsworth house a year later, we stayed in a different room. Though this room was advertised as haunted, it did not elicit fear. Later research revealed it was a newer addition, not part of the original building, and therefore not haunted. For those seeking an authentic experience, staying in the original structure, preferably the Sweeney Room, is strongly advised to fully engage with the historical and spectral atmosphere. Story 9. I live in Methuen, Massachusetts, on our own property that houses a relatively new house built around 1996. Before that, no housing had ever existed on this land for perhaps 300 years. I can guarantee that Massachusetts is frigging haunted almost everywhere, and I truly mean almost everywhere. Over the years, I have experienced and witnessed so many inexplicable occurrences in this brand new house that any ordinary person would likely move out immediately. From my childhood, I recall a monster, possibly some form of demonic force, that appeared in my window a few times each year. It would lock my door from the outside and terrify me with glowing red eyes and loud, bone-chilling sounds. A strange combination of a growling bear, wolf, and screaming fisher cat all at once. The noise seemed to come from every corner of my room, leaving no escape. I would scream and cry like I was being killed, shaking violently as I pulled at the door, but it refused to budge. The only way the door could open during these events was if someone attempted it from the hallway, never from inside my room. My parents would rush upstairs each time, hearing my horrifying screams and banging on the door, and each time they assured me nothing was wrong, that it was only a nightmare. Yet I could not return to my room and had to sleep in their bed for the night. Even today, I cannot explain how I could tug and pull at the door without opening it, given that the builders specifically omitted locks on my bedroom door to prevent 3-year-old me from locking myself in on the second floor. Fast forward to about a year ago. I was preparing food in the kitchen, heating a pizza in the oven, when I suddenly felt an intense wave of unease. Goosebumps covered my arms as if something unseen was watching me from over my shoulder. Turning quickly, I clearly saw a shadow in the shape of a person, visible in an instant. This was mid-afternoon on an overcast day, and the kitchen was normally bright, so no freaking shadow could explain what I saw. I remained silent, trying to shake off the goosebumps, and turned back to face the oven, attempting to focus on preparing the pizza. That's when I saw the frigging jar of tomato sauce begin unscrewing its own lid and pop neatly to the side. exactly as I had seen my mother do dozens of times. Yet there was absolutely nothing near it, nothing touching it, and no logical explanation for what was happening. The jar had simply opened itself, as if some unseen presence wanted to make itself known in the most startling way possible. I let out a scream louder than anything I had ever imagined, a pure mixture of shock, disbelief, and genuine terror, echoing through the kitchen and leaving me frozen in place. Neighbor even called to check if I was okay. I tried everything to replicate the phenomenon, including placing the jar in the oven to test if heat caused the lid to pop, but nothing, absolutely nothing, could reproduce it. I searched endlessly online for scientific explanations for jars opening spontaneously, but every attempt came up empty. The incident left me shaken and perplexed. Later that day, I called my mother, begging her to come home early because I was too frightened to remain alone in the house. My mother, Lisa, shared a similar experience in confidence. After I described the jar incident, she paused and asked if I had seen any unexplainable shadows around the same time. When I said yes, I could feel the hair on her arms stand up through the phone. She recounted an event from a month prior. While bringing laundry upstairs to her room, she saw a shadow of a person move across the room. Normally, she would not have been startled, as growing up in Massachusetts, one becomes accustomed to shadow people and strange occurrences. However, the shadow then floated toward her treadmill, knocking both cup holders and all their contents, including a notepad, pens, and headphones, straight onto the floor, entirely unassisted. She reassured me not to panic, explaining that she had witnessed similar unexplained occurrences over the years, noting that these entities do not appear to be harmful. Instead, she described them as existing between dimensions, sometimes becoming disoriented about which plane they occupy. On a personal note, I have a twin who died early in the womb, a girl with Down syndrome, and I often wonder if it is my twin keeping watch over me. As for the demonic presence that haunted me during childhood, I still have freaking no idea. The house continues to challenge rational explanation, making life in Massachusetts both fascinating and unsettling. Story 10. I work graveyard shifts as an unarmed security guard, and although I jokingly call myself Officer Rent-A-Cop, I take my duties seriously. I have held the same post for nearly 1 year, becoming familiar with every corner of the property, each creaking floorboard, and subtle nighttime sounds. While the area is bustling during the day, nights bring an eerie stillness that can play tricks on the mind. With a police station directly across the street, my presence primarily satisfies insurance requirements and deters anyone bold enough to attempt stealing construction materials, a scenario I have encountered only once. The main project is an office building with an attached multi-level parking structure still under construction, looming over the surrounding lot like a skeletal frame. The back of the property sits behind a tall concrete wall, beyond which a busy highway runs parallel, its constant hum blending into the distant city noises. At night, the shadows cast by the building stretch unnaturally long, and the occasional reflection of passing headlights makes shapes move in ways the mind wants to explain but can't fully account for, giving the lot a surreal, almost cinematic quality. One night, maybe a week or two after Thanksgiving, I sat in my car, fully engrossed in an especially long session of Plague Inc., a game in which I repeatedly ended all of Earth's inhabitants through creatively exaggerated and grotesque methods. The snow had begun settling lightly on the windshield, and while it slightly obscured my view, I was so focused on the game that I barely noticed. Each in-game scenario required precise attention, strategy, and patience, and the quiet of the night amplified every click and decision, making me feel entirely in control of a tiny digital world, even as the real one held subtle mysteries outside the glass. A thin layer of snow had settled on my windshield during my last patrol, slightly blurring the dim lights of the parking structure and street lamps. Even though I couldn't see clearly, I kept playing, knowing the quiet night allowed me uninterrupted focus. Being a good security guard is all about knowing your priorities, or so I told myself, balancing vigilance for the real world with my desire to escape into the game's fictional chaos. Every crunch of snow beneath tires or footsteps echoed unnervingly, keeping my senses slightly heightened despite the distraction of my screen. That all changed when something violently rattled my car, a sharp jolt that immediately pulled me out of my digital world and into complete awareness of my surroundings. While I don't carry a firearm, I always keep my nunchaku on me, blue belt in kung fu and all, because one never knows when a night might demand it. I grabbed them along with my Nebo O2 beam flashlight and cautiously stepped out, scanning the lot for any sign of what could have caused the violent shake. Every shadow seemed amplified, every building edge a potential hiding spot, and the biting cold made me hyper-aware of my own movement. I immediately assumed my field supervisor was attempting to startle me, as he occasionally tried to sneak up on guards with little success, though humor was never his strong suit. Yet no one was visible anywhere around the property. Fresh snow covered the ground in an even, unbroken layer, leaving no footprints or tire tracks besides my own. I began to consider environmental explanations, a branch of logic desperately trying to make sense of the seemingly impossible. But just as I was about to dismiss it, the disturbance struck again, stronger this time, resonating through the car in a way that defied rational explanation. This time, standing on the ground, the sensation felt less like shaking and more like a powerful, high-amplitude current flowing through the earth, a vibration that made the hairs on my arms rise. Fully alert, I immediately switched to the emergency scanner app on my phone to check for any reports of earthquakes, explosions, or accidents nearby. My mind raced through scenarios that could justify the intensity and timing of the vibrations, all while maintaining the practical consideration of my own safety and the responsibility to monitor the property effectively during my shift. There was no communication for a solid 5 minutes, and then the scanner picked up some routine chatter about a drunk driver across town, utterly unrelated to my location.
All right, we're back.
I felt increasingly unsettled, the quiet and emptiness of the night amplifying my unease.
Okay.
Rather than return to the safety of my car, I opted to start my next patrol early, reasoning that walking the lot myself might provide both reassurance and perspective.
This is not good.
I knew the site was probably fine, but being proactive in this instance seemed wise and necessary. I began inspecting the parking structure. Only one entrance was accessible where my car was parked, but the cold night made squatters a possibility even if unlikely. Every step echoed against the concrete, each shadow twisting and stretching in ways that suggested figures moving just beyond the corners of vision. Despite the frigid temperature and long night ahead, I pressed on, determined to maintain control of the situation and my own nerves. Nothing appeared out of place. Yet the sense of being watched lingered. I still had one earbud in to monitor scanner traffic. A domestic disturbance call came through, then silence again, emphasizing the night's solitude and heightening my alertness. Then, without warning, the rumbling returned, stronger, and I felt the structure itself seemingly wobble beneath me. Checking the last corner, I decided it was safest to retreat, anticipating a potential collapse even though rationally, I knew the building was stable. As I left the garage, something in my peripheral vision drew my attention upward. On the roof, 2 security lights glowed, yet one was partially blocked by construction equipment, casting jagged shadows. I saw what appeared to be the silhouette of a man standing atop the building, and though I tried to rationalize it as a trick of light or a pile of lumber, the outline was unnervingly human in shape. By this point, my paranoia was reaching its peak, a factor I carefully considered while assessing the situation, though it offered no comfort whatsoever. I retrieved my binoculars from the car, confident they would reveal the silhouette to be nothing more than a trick of the eye, mere heightened pareidolia and a stack of 2x4s. Returning to the car nearly made me lose my crap. There was an impression across the hood in the snow, as though someone had lain down, and 2 melted handprints marked the windshield, perfectly placed. No footprints, no additional tracks, nothing that could explain the marks except my own. The sensation of intrusion was immediate and visceral, sending a shiver down my spine despite the cold air and distance from the silhouette above. I pulled out my phone, unsure of what I intended to do, and found it powered off, battery completely drained. Moments earlier, it had been plugged in and charged to over 90%, yet now it was lifeless. A tangible confirmation that something inexplicable had occurred. Feeling the rumble once again, I quickly got into my car after checking the backseat thoroughly and drove to the far end of the site, reasoning that if squatters were responsible, they would be visible. Supervisors and foremen never mentioned anything, and when I asked another guard if he had experienced unusual activity, he merely shrugged. I still have no explanation for what happened that night, and thinking back, The combination of subtle environmental anomalies, impossible physical traces, and the silhouetted figure creates a memory that is equally frightening, surreal, and unexplainable to this day. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss an update.